Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for a history video. In this video, I'm going to give my picks for the 10 most important battles of the Crusades. In other words, these are the battles that I think had the most historical ramifications in terms of the history of the Crusades, the history of the Middle East, and the history of medieval Europe. While there are a lot of different crusades in the Middle Ages, I'm limiting this video's scope to the 9 numbered crusades, all of which were Western Christian military expeditions that began with the goal of going to the Middle East to either capture or defend territory in the Holy Land. Before we get to the list, here's a really fast rundown of what caused the Crusades in the first place. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. He was doing so in response from a plea for help from the Byzantine Emperor, who had lost several battles in a row to the Seljuk Turks, a group that converted to Islam right around 1000 CE. The emperor wanted help defeating them. The Seljuks had also conquered land from various Islamic powers in the region, including Jerusalem. Before the Seljuk conquest of the city, it was easy for European Christians to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, but the Seljuks were a lot less amenable and tolerant than their predecessors. It was these twin factors that led to the First Crusade: the call for help from the Byzantine Emperor and a concern about the future of pilgrimage to the holiest city in all of Christianity. Ultimately, the First Crusade was a success, and the Crusaders set up several states in the Levant. When we say Crusades, we're referring not only to the 9 numbered military expeditions, but also to battles that occurred in the region between the Crusader states and their neighbors. Alright, now that I've explained that, let's get to the list. At number 10, I have the Battle of Ager Sanguinis. Ager Sanguinis is Latin for field of blood. This battle occurred in 1119 between the ruler of Aleppo, Ilghazi, and the ruler of the Principality of Antioch, Roger of Salerno. You can see on this map just how close Aleppo is to the borders of this Crusader state. By 1119, a couple decades had passed since the conclusion of the First Crusade, and in the years that had passed, various Muslim powers in the region had tried to get rid of the Crusaders, but they failed. In fact, the Crusaders had largely expanded their holdings in the last couple of decades. In 1118, Roger had captured a key fortress near Aleppo that would serve as a staging point for an attack on Ilghazi's city. Ilghazi responded in 1119 by invading the Principality of Antioch. Roger intended to stay behind fortifications in a mountain pass and wait for Ilghazi to come to him and force him to besiege him rather than meet him in a pitched battle. Ilghazi began besieging Al-Atrib, a fortified city under Roger's rule that was near the pass, and then suddenly began to retreat back into his territory. Roger assumed that this was good news and that Ilghazi had called off the attack, but it turned out to be a feigned retreat. Roger sent his forces out to try to secure Al-Atrib, only to be ambushed by Ilghazi's army, forcing a retreat back into the pass. Roger and much of his army escaped this horrible ambush, but then Roger chose a bad place to camp in the wooded valley. He thought the steep hills and vegetation would make it so Ilghazi could only attack from one side, but there's a big downside there too. He had nowhere to retreat. Additionally, Ilghazi knew there were some pass he could utilize to slowly deploy his men and surround Roger and his army in the pass. On the night of June 27th, 1119, his army quietly surrounded Roger's forces. The battle began on the 28th, but it was pretty much over before it started. Roger was killed and most of his army was killed or captured, and Ilghazi had won a decisive victory. Ilghazi's forces captured several fortified towns and castles on the frontier of the Principality of Antioch. Ilghazi didn't manage to capture Antioch itself, partly because he went on a hardcore drinking binge, but this battle was key because it halted Antioch's territorial expansion and proved these Crusaders could be beaten decisively, something that wasn't exactly clear before the Battle of Ager Sanguinis. At number 9, I have the Siege of Edessa, which occurred in 1144 between the First and Second Crusades. Edessa was a Crusader state that was conquered by Baldwin of Bologna during the First Crusade, and it was actually the very first Crusader state established. Between the end of the First Crusade in 1099 and the 1140s, most Muslim attempts to retake territory conquered by the Crusaders failed. The Battle of Ager Sanguinis we just talked about was one of the few exceptions. These failures were largely because there was a lack of Muslim unity in the region, with the various rulers bickering among themselves and not really working together. This all began to change, though, in the late 1130s with the rise of a man named Zengi, who consolidated Islamic rule in the region, conquering Aleppo, Hama, Mosul, and other territories. He then set his sights on Edessa, which he thought to be the least well-defended of the Crusader states. And he was right. Things were made worse by the fact that Jocelyn II, the ruler of Edessa, and most of his military forces had left the city to ally with another Islamic ruler in the region to fight against Zengi in Aleppo itself. The Bishop of Edessa was left in charge of a small force to defend the city, and he really didn't know what he was doing. Zengi took advantage, going around Jocelyn's army and capturing the city and the county of Edessa after a short siege. After this, he was able to easily break Jocelyn's attack on Aleppo. Edessa would remain in Muslim hands for the rest of the crusading period. This battle is important for two big reasons. First, it marked the beginning of an increasing desire among Muslims to unify against the Crusader threat. Zengi and his successors would continue their conquests, ultimately culminating with Saladin capturing Jerusalem in 1187. Second, it led to the call for the Second Crusade, which ultimately ended in failure, further illustrating that Islamic power in the region was now on the rise. At number 8, I have the Battle of Montgisard, which occurred in 1177. You can draw a pretty direct line between the Siege of Edessa and the Battle of Montgisard, as they are both part of the decades-long Muslim offensive against the Crusaders, which started with Zengi. By now, Saladin had become the major ruler in the region, and he and his predecessor, Nur al-Din, had managed to consolidate Muslim power even more. He ruled over a large state called the Ayyubid Caliphate, which surrounded the Crusaders on all sides. Once Saladin had consolidated his power in the region, his sights were set on conquering the Crusader states. The king of Jerusalem at the time was Baldwin IV. He was a sickly 16-year-old who suffered from leprosy, and at most he could summon an army of around 4,000. Saladin believed him to be weak and launched his invasion in 1177 with somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 troops at his disposal. Ultimately, his underestimation of Baldwin was his downfall. He encountered Baldwin at Ascalon, but left a small force to deal with him as he continued north. Believing the victory was assured, Saladin allowed his army to drift out of formation and raid and pillage. Meanwhile, back in Ascalon, Baldwin and his army defeated the small force Saladin left, and they began moving north rapidly. Baldwin and his 4,000 men caught up with Saladin's slow-moving, disorganized army at Montgisard. Remaining in their tightly packed formation, the Crusader army tore through Saladin's army, and Saladin himself was only barely able to escape. He would never again try to invade the Crusader states during Baldwin's rule, as he now greatly respected him. Instead, the two sides entered into a peace arrangement for the next decade or so. Baldwin's victory here averted the ultimate disaster, and Jerusalem remained in the hands of the Crusaders. At number 7, I have the Siege of Acre, which was part of the Third Crusade. We saw earlier that Saladin was defeated at Montgisard in 1177, but about a decade later, he led a more successful invasion that captured most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which included the Holy City itself, as well as the city of Acre. Acre was a coastal city and was of major importance both strategically and economically. After Saladin's successful conquest of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187, a Third Crusade was called, and both the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, and the King of France, Philip Augustus, agreed to go on this crusade to take the city back. Now, the siege of Acre began before the two kings even got there. The King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, began besieging the city in 1189, but he wasn't making a lot of headway. He just didn't have the manpower or materials. The defenders of the city used Greek fire and had destroyed all of his catapults and other siege engines, and those were crucial to attack a city with formidable walls like Acre. Philip and Richard arrived in Acre in the summer of 1191, and they brought with them much-needed manpower, and they built huge catapults that had a long enough range that Greek fire wasn't a problem. For months, they battered the walls of Acre, and by July, they were beginning to crumble. On July 12th, the defenders of the city surrendered, and Acre was recaptured by the Crusaders. This would end up being the biggest military victory of the Third Crusade, which ultimately failed to capture Jerusalem. Jerusalem might not have been captured, but taking back Acre at least gave the so-called King of Jerusalem a major city under his control, and it would remain in the hands of the Crusaders all the way until 1291. As we'll see later in this video, it would be the last major Crusader city to fall. At number 6, I have both sieges of Constantinople, which occurred during the Fourth Crusade. So, the Fourth Crusade is a pretty wacky one. It originally planned to attack the Ayyubid territory in Egypt with a plan of capturing all of the Ayyubid Sultanate, including the Holy Land. However, they ended up attacking the Christian city of Constantinople instead. The Crusaders were in a huge amount of debt to the Venetians, who had built them a fleet, and the wily Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, had managed to leverage that debt into helping him attack the Christian city of Zara, and then also Constantinople. A deposed Byzantine prince was also involved. The whole thing is pretty crazy, but what matters here for us is that the Crusaders did something pretty unthinkable, and they did it twice. They captured the city of Constantinople, something that countless other major powers had failed to do over the years. So how did they do it? Well, the Venetians had built the Crusaders high-tech horse transports that allowed knights to ride their horses right off the ships, and they built ships that could support large siege engines to attack the walls directly. After the first siege, they put a new emperor on the throne, but he was unable to give the Crusaders the money they needed, so they captured the city again. This ultimately led to the Crusaders setting up a new Crusader state, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. This was relatively short-lived, but the damage done by this crusade cannot be overstated. While the Byzantines regained control of the empire by the mid-13th century, the Crusader conquest of the territory had inflicted a serious wound on the Byzantine Empire, one which it never recovered from. It sort of limped along as a fairly weak state for a couple of more centuries, before being captured by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. At number 5, I have the Battle of Mansurah. There are actually 2 battles of Mansurah in the crusading period, one during the 5th Crusade and one during the 7th. They're both important, but I think the one that occurred during the 7th Crusade is the most important one. So the 7th Crusade's plan was to conquer the Ayyubid capital of Cairo, thus capturing all the territory under its control. The 4th Crusade also had this plan, but unlike the 4th, the 7th Crusade actually made it to Egypt. In 1250, things looked really good for the 7th Crusade, which was under the leadership of Louis IX of France. They easily captured the coastal fortress of Damietta in June of 1249, and while they were planning their next move, the Ayyubid Sultan, As-Salit Ayyub, died. He's the same guy I talked about back in the chess video. His death came as a result of a poisoned chessboard. Meanwhile, the new Ayyubid Sultan was all the way in Syria. The Crusaders jumped at the chance and began marching south along the Nile in November of 1249. But they quickly found out this wasn't going to be easy. While the new Ayyubid Sultan was on his way, the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers, were put in control of the army, with a man named Baybars as one of their most effective generals, and he's also someone who would go down as one of history's greatest generals. So, yeah, the situation was not as good as it might have looked at first. Baybars led guerrilla attacks all along the Nile that slowed the Crusader army. He wanted to slow them down so that he could mass as large of a force as possible in Mansurah, a fortified city on the Nile that was between Damietta and Cairo. The Crusaders didn't get there until February of 1250, and when they did, things did not go well. Robert of Artois, one of Louis's brothers, led a vanguard into the camp outside of Mansurah, and he fell for a feigned retreat. Those in the camp almost immediately retreated when they saw them, and then Robert realized the doors of the city were wide open. He was supposed to wait for the rest of the army to catch up with him, but sensing victory, he and his army charged inside the city, only to hear the doors of the city slam shut behind them. They were now trapped and surrounded by Baybars and his army. Robert and almost the entire vanguard were killed. Meanwhile, Louis assumed his brother was waiting for him to begin his attack, but instead of finding his brother's army, he found the Ayyubid army, which pinned him against a canal. After 2 days of fighting, Louis and his army retreated and set up a new camp on the other side of the canal. The Crusader camp was then besieged, and it ultimately fell on April 5th of 1250, and the 7th Crusade ended in abject failure. This battle is important not only because it ended the 7th Crusade, but it was also a key step for Baybars and the other Mamluks. Not long after this crusade, the Mamluks overthrew the Ayyubid Sultan without much resistance, and they set up a new state called the Mamluk Sultanate. They were seen as the saviors of the Muslim world, and they took advantage of that opportunity. Baybars himself became Mamluk Sultan in 1260, and he would continue to win victory after victory against the Crusaders, as well as invading Mongols, all of which would cement the reputation of him as one of the greatest generals in history, sometimes known as Baybars the Invincible. At number 4, I have another siege of Acre, this one occurring in 1291 and marking the end of the crusading period. In 1291, Acre was all the Crusaders had left. Everything else they had been conquered. In April of that year, the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil began a siege on the city with a massive army. The Crusaders ultimately refused to surrender, and with their backs against the wall, seemed to have really believed that they could be victorious. And there was some reasons for optimism. Acre had huge and impressive fortifications that had only become larger in recent decades as various nobles from Europe sent large sums of money to help fortify this last Crusader stronghold. Additionally, since Acre was all that was left, most of what was left of the knightly orders were concentrated in this city. Knightly orders were warriors who took monastic oaths and lived much as monks did, but they also fought and were the elite warriors in the Crusader army. The most famous of these orders that emerged during the Crusades were the Knights Templar, but there are others too, namely the Knights of St. Lazarus, the Teutonic Knights, and the Knights Hospitaller. Acre was pretty much filled to the brim with reinforcements too, coming from throughout Christendom when they heard this was all that was left. However, after a month of bombarding the city with massive boulders, Khalil and his army got into the city on May 18th, and while the knightly orders refused to surrender and fought street to street for almost a month, with many fighting to the last man and inflicting massive casualties on Khalil's army, his numbers were just too much in the end. By June 15th of 1291, Acre was in hands of the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Crusades were over. At number 3, I have the Siege of Antioch, which occurred during the First Crusade. You might think that the conquest of Jerusalem was the biggest victory of the First Crusade, and in some ways, it was, but I think that the Siege of Antioch was really the make-or-break point for the Crusaders. The Crusaders barely succeeded there, and if they hadn't, the whole endeavor of the Crusades would have gone up in smoke, and none of these other battles would have ever happened. So the Crusaders reached Antioch in October of 1097, and they were in rough shape, to put it mildly. They had endured a difficult trek through Asia Minor, where the environment and Seljuk raids had depleted their numbers. When you besiege a city, you really shouldn't be the one starving, but that's how things were for the Crusaders when they reached Antioch. They were able to besiege the city, but there were many deaths and desertions as conditions worsened. By late May of 1098, they still weren't anywhere close to getting into the city, they'd eaten many of their horses, and some major leaders of the Crusades had bailed entirely. Despite all this, the Crusaders did manage to fight off some attempts to break their siege, but in May they got word that Kerboga of Mosul was headed their way with an army of 40,000, an army made up of a coalition of other Muslim rulers in the region. The Crusaders knew that he could easily break their siege, and if they hadn't taken the city by the time he got there, they would be defeated. At this point, one of the leaders of the crusade, the Italian Norman Bohemond of Taranto, came up with a plan. Knowing they didn't have the strength to take the city in a traditional way, Bohemond began reaching out to Christians in the city and eventually found one who was willing to open the gates. This went down on June 3rd of 1098, and the Crusaders got into the city. Unfortunately, though, this did not solve their problems. There was no food in the city either, and things continued to look quite dire. The Crusaders felt they had been abandoned by God, but at just the right time, one of the soldiers of the crusade, a man named Peter Bartholomew, received a vision and claimed he knew where the Holy Lance was. This was the lance that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. Underneath the church in Antioch, he began to dig, and miraculously, he produced the lance, and the army was reinvigorated at just the right time. The lance was found on June 27th of 1098, and Kerboga and his army arrived on June 28th of 1098. The Crusaders knew they had no hope of waiting out a siege given their condition, and as Kerboga approached, they began to form up lines outside the walls of the city, intending to fight a pitched battle instead. Kerboga's scouts misinterpreted the situation and assumed that it meant they were giving up the city and going home. He allowed his army to break formation as they approached the city, and only once he was close enough to see it himself did he realize that the Crusaders were fighting, not retreating. The Crusaders had gotten all of their remaining horses together for a surprising cavalry charge, and somehow, despite being outnumbered, hungry, and sick, the Crusaders pushed back Kerboga's army. At this point, his allies, realizing that the death of Kerboga would make it easier for them to consolidate power in the region, abandoned him, and Kerboga was forced to retreat. The Crusaders felt that this victory was a miracle. After all, Peter Bartholomew rode at the front of the army with the Holy Lance, and victory was theirs. There are 3 factors here that led to victory against all odds. First, the Crusaders had great morale as a result of the discovery of the lance. Second, Kerboga's allies weren't that interested in helping him. And third, his scouts gave him that faulty report. Anyway, after they were able to rest up in Antioch, the Crusaders ultimately headed south and captured Jerusalem with relative ease. At number 2, I have the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Most probably figured that this would be number 1 on the list. It's a particularly well-known battle, partly as a result of the film Kingdom of Heaven, and it was certainly a very important one. Though, obviously enough, I do think there is one that's even more important. Anyway, Hattin is the culmination of Saladin's second attempt to invade the Kingdom of Jerusalem. We saw earlier that his first attempt failed at Montgisard, but this time he would succeed. I mentioned that after Montgisard, there was about a decade of peace between the Crusaders and Ayyubids, but this eventually collapsed, largely as a result of the actions of one man, Reynald of Chatillon. He ignored the terms of the peace and started attacking Muslim merchant trains just because he wanted to. The king of Jerusalem at the time was the rather ineffectual Guy of Lusignan, who could not get Reynald under control. After several attacks on Muslims that were supposed to be protected by peace, Saladin was fed up and invaded again. Guy decided to head out from Acre to meet Saladin, but Saladin cleverly blocked their access to water sources in the region. The Crusaders chose a camp near the horns of Hattin, but this would solidify their downfall. Saladin's army were able to force the Crusaders up one of the horns, trapping them. Ultimately, they were forced to surrender, and Saladin would easily conquer Jerusalem in the aftermath. The Crusader states never really recovered from this loss. Jerusalem would intermittently be in their hands in the coming century, but never for very long, and from here on, the Crusader states largely began to contract. And at number 1, I have the Battle of La Forbie. This is certainly a less famous battle than Hattin, but I think it's the more consequential one. Hattin may have been key in weakening the Crusader states in the long term, but La Forbie is the battle that assured the eventual end of the Crusader states. So in 1244, Jerusalem had actually been in the hands of the Crusaders again. But on July 15th of that year, a group called the Khwarezmians, who were fleeing Mongol invasions, headed west with the intention of allying themselves with the Ayyubids. Along the way, they stopped and captured Jerusalem with very little effort. In response, the military forces in the Crusader states consolidated into an army of about 11,000, and 4,000 of them were from knightly orders. This was a large and formidable force, to be sure. Unfortunately for them, by the time they got their stuff together, the Khwarezmians had joined up with the Ayyubids, in particular a force under the leadership of Baybars, the same Baybars who would later be victorious at Mansurah. Baybars used one of his favorite moves for the first time here, the feigned retreat, to draw in a Frankish cavalry charge. Before they knew it, the Crusaders had sprung his trap and the entire cavalry was surrounded by the much larger Ayyubid Khwarezmian army. In the end, 7,500 of the 11,000 Crusaders were killed, and 3,998 of those 4,000 members of the knightly orders were also killed. The Grand Masters of these orders all fell on the battlefield as well. This was a crippling loss for the Crusader states. Hattin was a terrible one, but it really only marked the end of one Crusader state, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For the most part, the other Crusader states continued on following Hattin. With the bulk of the Crusader military force being crushed at La Forbie, it really marked the beginning of the end for the other Crusader states too, eventually culminating in the fall of Acre in 1291. Additionally, if Baybars hadn't had such success against the Crusaders at La Forbie, he wouldn't have been called in to serve as general during the 7th Crusade, nor would he have emerged as the leader of the Mamluk Sultanate who would continue to defeat the Crusaders in coming decades. This battle not only ensured that the Crusaders would never hold Jerusalem again, it also ensured that the Crusaders would be incapable of holding onto their territory in the region. So, those are my picks for the 10 most consequential battles of the Crusades. You think I left any out? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you're interested in seeing some more of my videos, including several more about the Crusades, you should see some of them on your screen now. Thanks for watching.